This is Invisible Inc., the podcast for BIPOC and Latina women entrepreneurs. And I'm your host, Shubha Chakravarti, founder of Achieve. In this podcast, I talk to women entrepreneurs at every stage of their journey about the challenges, the highs, the lows, and what they've learned along the way. We'll also hear from experts who'll share valuable tips on how to succeed the smart way. Let's jump in. What's better than curing cancer? Preventing it from occurring in the first place, of course. But how does someone with a finance background and no healthcare credentials not only start such a firm, but quickly progress to acquire venture capital? And most of all, how does this entrepreneur pull this all off while being Black and female? Feyi Ayodele, founder of CancerIQ, answers all these questions and more in today's episode. Let's jump in. Thank you, Faye. It's really exciting to have you here today. I know a little bit about your company, CancerIQ, and it's truly inspiring. So can you tell us a little bit what CancerIQ is and what the company does?
CancerIQ is a company who has a mission to end cancer as we know it through early detection and prevention of the disease. We offer a platform that helps your provider stratify risk and understand patients who have a predisposition so that they can get ahead of cancer instead of having to respond to it.
What's the core of your approach to doing that?
Our secret sauce is using all available data possible. Instead of just using age as something to understand people's risk, we use genomic information, we use behavioral and social information, and even adherence information to predict who might be at risk of getting a late-stage cancer.
So what gave you the idea for this business?
So it's really the model that we enable with CancerIQ is something that's been tried and tested really with thought leaders in academic centers, including my mother, who's a great mom and a wonderful medical oncologist and geneticist, but she's also a MacArthur Genius Award winner for her work.
Wow, so it runs in the family, huh?
She's been doing this for a very long time. The challenge and the problem that we're trying to solve at CancerIQ is really democratizing access to that kind of service. Because not all patients can be seen by my mom, not all patients can be seen in an academic center. We need to make it so that the everyday provider in front of you is as capable of offering a kind of precision prevention service as those in academia. So every provider has the clinical confidence and every provider has the workflow tools that they need to make it easy.
I looked at your professional profile briefly, and you've got a very heavy finance background. Looking at the whole STEM field and getting funding, is that STEM is hard enough as it is. So how did you make that switch? What made you decide to say, I'm going to switch from finance into this completely new medical?
So I think I was thinking about my long-term career progression. I think as a finance person, you're always really just looking at the financial aspects of things. So I started my career off in investment banking, then I moved on to private equity. And when you're trying to add value at the point when you're actually investing in companies as a private equity investor, you realize that it helps to have some sort of industry expertise or some sort of operating experience. So to start building some of that operating experience, I transitioned from finance to management consulting with McKinsey. And lo and behold, at McKinsey, I found I still wasn't getting that operating experience that I felt I needed to really scale businesses and make an impact. So that's when I chose to take some time to really explore different opportunities. Healthcare was near and dear to my heart. And it was through the experience that I had working in healthcare with my mother at the University of Chicago that I felt more passionate about solving problems there than I felt about generic problems in the C-suite of companies across the country.
So you have an idea, you found your passion when you were working at the UFC. What happened next? Like, how did you think about approaching this? How did it coalesce into a business idea? How did you think about funding? Can you just walk us through, like, put us in the room, make us a fly on the wall?
Yeah, so I think one of the advantages that I had being a finance professional was just understanding how investors think. As the founder of a company, you are the biggest investor in the company. So I took the same approach that an investor would in evaluating the opportunity. I knew there was a strong clinical need, and I knew there was a potential solution But one thing it's important to figure out as a founder is how you're going to make money doing what you're doing. And that's where I'd say that, my background as a finance professional was probably put me in an advantage. Very early on in the company, I figured out our business model. I figured out the return on investment that I was going to try and deliver to every customer that I tried to work with. And I knew that investors were going to want to see this kind of commercial traction in order for them to make an investment decision. So I worked really hard on getting that commercial traction as early as possible. In fact, too early. My very first customers, I had actually, sold the software to and got orders and signed contracts before we'd fully even built the software. Because it's really on the back of those invoices and of those contracts that I could give investors confidence that we had a commercial opportunity. And they gave me even more money than those initial customers that paid for CancerIQ.
So it sounds to me like the fact that you went in with this a priori experience in finance was a huge help to you. Did you feel that it reduced the barrier that you had to overcome in establishing your credibility, or how did that play out in the whole funding process?
At the end of the day, I had so many things against me when it came to credibility. I was first time in healthcare. I was really young. I was female. I was Black. There were just so many things that didn't work out for me. And because of that, I needed to make sure that the other areas that investors evaluate were really solid. Product had to be solid. Commercial strategy had to be, solid. Showing product market fit, again, through those early customer contracts was really important. And that's really how I overcame all of the other reasons not to invest in me. I also tried to surround myself with people who are brilliant and had been around the block before. Again, my mother is a huge thought leader in the space, so there was a lot of clinical credibility. But early on, I had people like, Nancy Harvey, who was an entrepreneur in residence at University of Chicago. She'd been CEO of multiple technology and healthcare companies. She was as an advisor. I had a technical advisor who was CTO of multiple healthcare technology companies that I borrowed initially to build that kind of credibility. And it's really by being humble in the places where I wasn't strong and leaning on people who did have strengths in those areas that I was able to be a more complete founder than relying on the company's competencies that I had on my own.
To what extent did it help that you were already part of for example, in this case, the University of Chicago's ecosystem, because you're working there and you had some experience? So if you were talking to somebody who didn't have that, what would you tell them in terms of how do you get those advisors? How do you establish credibility? How do you get them to even respond to an email that says, hey, can you just tell me anything about how I should proceed?
I think it's important to be part of some community, wherever that is. And there are multiple opportunities to become part of a community here in Chicago. When I was starting my company, that was when 1871 opened up. That's when Matter opened up. That's when I had an opportunity to be part of the Rock Health Accelerator program. Mm-hmm. So I think it's the way things work in the early stage investing market. It is truly through those community connections. So if I were starting this company again, I would make sure what weren't at the University of Chicago, I would make sure I was plugged into those ecosystems and communities.
You already referenced the fact that you had a business model in mind. Can you walk us through how those played out in the real world as you brought your product to market, what your learnings were, and how you evolved your strategy as you gained more traction with your core customer group?
Core to my commercial strategy was making sure I was delivering value to people and that I was quantifying that value, particularly in healthcare, where the entire healthcare ecosystem is almost trained to read research papers that really validate outcomes and those kinds of things. I knew that in order for us to get the highest pricing or get people willing to pay for CancerIQ, I needed to deliver value that was more than what they were going to pay. So our initial commercial strategy was around a forecast, right? I'm a financial analyst. I was really good at forecasting. It was about forecasting the value to my customers and then hoping and praying that we delivered that value. Has evolved on as a company. It's not just a desktop exercise on what value we might be able to deliver to a health system. These are real values that we've been able to track and quantify on a number of our early adopter health systems. So how's our commercial strategy evolved? It went from, being something that was more of a illustrative desktop exercise to something that we've proven over and over and over again in over 170 different hospitals across the country.
So it sounds like this tracking of expectations to reality is kind of built into the DNA of your whole business model, just because that's the nature of the market you serve.
I don't know if everybody's company is like this, but our company is really driven by data. It's in data we trust. I myself, again, I come from a financial services background where data is what drives everything. Valuations of companies are based on information that you have and potential forecasts. My co-founder was literally a professional data scientist. His first job was at a quant hedge fund. And then he was basically head of operations for the Chinese men's basketball team. Wow, using a Moneyball analytics program that he developed. So we just in our culture believe in data. And I think those are smart decisions that we made from the jump, so that we're thinking ahead about the things we want to measure. So as the data comes in, we can share that data with others.
Are there other either more qualitative or not guiding pillars that tell you if there's a fork in the road, here's how I'll go, right?
Patients first. We learned that things that are good for patients are good for everybody. I think it was really important that that be one of our core values, because in the healthcare market in general, there are just so many sexy things going on. There are companies that are out there using big data to treat late stage cancers or help new and cutting edge therapies come to market. I think those are great companies that need to exist. But when I think about what's actually best for patients, it's not treating a cancer when it's late stage. It's actually not getting cancer at all.
In the first place.
And, while there's probably like more money and more flowing out there in the ecosystem trying to tackle the 1% of patients that fall into that unfortunate category where they need a life-saving drug, I've always stuck to what is actually best for the patient. And prevention and early detection is really an area that is hot and sexy now.
We can talk a little bit about customer acquisition. It sounds like you already had a head start because you're in the ecosystem. Your mother had the clinical gravitas and the credibility to pull this off. Can you talk a little bit more in detail in terms of just how did you go into acquiring customers? How did you approach them? What was that process like?
Ooh, it was hard. It was really hard.
That's why I want to talk about it.
So in the beginning, again, I had to really focus on what the value was. And what was hard in the beginning is I didn't have any data to defend that, nor did I even have a product. So I had wireframes and I had some articulation of value. And I said, if you pay me and I will build this thing that will do this thing. And I think those early sales, you've got to be collaborative and work with people who want to see something exist. And I think that goes for even investors too. Sometimes the earliest angel investors are people that just want to see a problem being solved. Those are the best kinds of early adopters to work with, because they'll be patient with you when you don't deliver or you're iterating on your product or you're still trying to find your way. And they're also the people that will be most likely to lead you to what the ultimate solution is, because they urgently need the problem to be solved. So that was really some of the lessons learned in our early commercialization stage. Was more about a partnership than a sale. It was about finding people who are aligned and trying to solve the same problem as you and getting them to believe that you are smart enough and have the ability to solve that.
So is it fair to say then that you were almost customer funded?
The amount my customers paid us were not nearly as much as we invested in the software.
Gotcha. Okay.
But it was really helpful in getting the investor fundraising traction that we needed.
So it was more the evidence of market demand rather than actual funding to push you. Say, hey, they're willing to write a check, right? So
they're willing to write a check, and it was pretty big. It was 5 figures.
With nothing to show for it. What would be helpful is for you to talk about how you thought about pricing. What were the factors you considered?
There are multiple ways of pricing. There's cost plus pricing. There is alternative pricing, like what would it cost you if you didn't have the solution? And then there's ROI-based pricing. And one of the key things that I learned while I was at the University of Chicago is that all the internal decisions that are made within health systems tend to be made, at least at the financial level, trying to think about the return on investment. So our initial pricing was, here's what I think the return is. And I chose a very high benchmark. I said, and if we give you a 10 times return on investment, here's what the pricing will be. Because that's what I thought was fair. And that's what I thought would get approved through the health system channel that I was working with. Now, one of the key things I stuck to, and I'm glad that I stuck to, is there's a huge temptation in doing things for free in the beginning, offering stuff for free or saying it's cheap just for the experience and just to get out there. Pricing for me was also a way to weed out the customers that didn't value what we were doing. I wanted customers who were willing to pay because I knew they were going to try harder to work with me and solve the problem.
There's more at stake, right, for them.
Yeah, sometimes people who get stuff for free don't treat your solution as if it is of value, and that creates for customer experiences that may not be as great. So my cautionary tale to other founders is never sell yourself short. Don't do stuff for free. Don't do stuff for free. You can do stuff, even the word pilot is a word that I think is a stinky word that too many founders get stuck in. I like to call it a phased implementation, where the first phase is where we're still evaluating it. And the second phase is where we're looking at things at scale. Pilots don't do anything for free.
Okay. And did you ever feel like that little qualm inside when you put a big number out there? Did you ever have to force yourself to get the number out?
I think it's good to have that conversation early. And one thing that is maybe a little bit more difficult because of the pandemic is I used to see people in person and give them a number and be able to read their body language on how they felt about that number. And if they nodded their heads and we were like, oh, okay, cool. Tell them it's a quarterly number, a monthly number. A lot of that, is how you do real price discovery. It's better to put a number that's too high and have someone laugh at you and tell you, and because then you're starting a conversation. You can basically ask why, and you can ask for feedback, and you can ask, well, what would it take for us to be worth that amount? And they can, give you the kind of product input that you need to make a scalable company.
So then switching gears slightly, you're the CEO of the company, but it just happens that you have a finance background as well. So can you talk a little bit about how you think about finance as it relates to your company today, wearing your CEO hat on? What are the things you look for and where do you focus?
I really needed to fire the finance side of myself as fast as possible. Even though I can do it, it's not a good use of my time. I think CEOs need to understand that they're the revenue generators. They're the people responsible for that top line of the business. And if you spend too much of your time trying to manage finances or do accounting, even if you have those kinds of skills, you're taking away time from that CEO role.
Which only you can do.
There are people who can do all sorts of finance stuff. That's actually one of the things I did very early. I was early adopter of a lot of SaaS technology companies. I put my entire company on a company called Zenefits. All the HR payroll stuff was handled. I outsourced all of my accounting to another company called Indenaro very quickly. When it came down to it, it's probably around my Series A round of funding, I realized that I was still spending too much time on the finance and operations piece of things. And that was holding me back from the parts of the company that really needed me.
So is that something that you'd recommend as a viable option for somebody starting out to say, hey, start looking at things you can offload?
Yes, offload as soon as possible and pay whatever you would pay in salary. So even from a pricing perspective, I think about that all the time. I could hire a finance person, or I could pay this service X dollars a month to make this happen.
If you could take off your finance expert hat for a second, the challenge we sometimes face with women founders is that they have some kind of a fear or a barrier about dealing with the finances. So they do want to offload it, but they don't want to have anything to do with it. And it seems like there's a fine balance. Do you have any thoughts?
I log into our bank account. I log into our company bank account every day.
Is that something you'd recommend all founders do?
No, I think it's important. I think you got to know. I think it's not that I don't want to be involved in it or I don't want to know it. I know my numbers. as CEO, I need to know how much runway we have. I need to know how much revenue we have. I need to know how much cash we have in the bank. And rather than finance be something that I don't want to involve myself in, it's more that I don't want to be involved in like the creation of the books or the creation of the forecast. But it's my responsibility to make sure we don't run out of money.
Yeah.
There's like two responsibilities of a CEO. Make sure you grow and make sure you do not run out of money.
So it sounds like even if you don't feel comfortable, like for somebody else who might not be as comfortable as you are, there is still that critical minimum of metrics, things that they have to keep their eye on pretty much on a regular basis.
That's
Great.
it. Know those things and you can make better executive decisions.
Even if I were to say money makes me squirm, I can easily manage 2 or 3 things, how many months runway, how much cash in the bank, how much revenue. Another aspect that I've seen, a big one that keeps coming up is this access to networks, right? For example, whether it's venture funding or even sometimes bank loans, on the commercial side, it depends who you know to be introduced to the right people, and then you're looked at very differently than somebody who came in cold, so to speak. What has been your experience in terms of access to networks? Has it been, and what has worked, what has been hard, what has been helpful?
If you can't do it as a woman, then find a man to do it for you. Period. I find that sometimes you just go uphill for too long. If you're not naturally someone who networks, if you naturally don't have access to things, there's a man that's in your network that does, and use them, and you can get their network. I regularly, prime examples, I play golf, but I play women's golf, and I'm not out there with all the, bigwigs who are playing golf with all the male executives, but I have investors who do that, and I ask them for help. So I feel like as a woman, if you don't have access to a network, you're not trying hard enough to leverage other people in your lives' networks.
And what would be some examples of the types of men that would be good to tap into?
Types of men that would
like, for example, is it somebody you used to work with? Is it somebody who you went to high school with? Is it somebody
somebody that you used to work with? It could be someone you meet in these communities. In these communities, there are women and men, and there's always someone to get to. But I think assuming that because they're networks that are closed to women doesn't mean you can't tap into the network by using a man who's in that network.
Great. And do you have I'm thinking about kind of the different kinds of people who'd be listening to this. Would there be things that you say don't look like, for example, if there's a relative or a family member, would you say no, or would you say, hey,
No, you use everybody. Use absolutely everybody possible.
Okay. So as long as you're comfortable having that conversation.
If you believe in what you're doing, you believe that, I genuinely believe that CancerIQ should be everywhere. And I genuinely believe that if it's access or if it's me trying to get to someone to tell them that is the only barrier, I'm willing to run through that barrier. It's valuable for them.
So the conviction is what opens the door to even get them to listen to you.
Yeah. I think maybe that's the other thing. I think that sometimes if you don't believe in yourself as a woman, then nobody else will. So you have to have very, very strong conviction, and that confidence will come out, and people will latch on to that level of confidence.
And that brings up a great question, right? Because one of the things, it's clear that you have a lot of passion, but I don't think even the strongest entrepreneurs always on the upswing, right? There's not always every moment where they're completely confident. So have there been moments where you've doubted some critical part of the journey of your model, of anything? What has helped you to overcome those? What has helped you to address those challenges when it's all inside? Like it's about self-doubt or diffidence.
Well, when you're starting a new company and you're innovating, sometimes nobody says no to what we're trying to do, by the way. Nobody's like, no, we don't want to do any cancer early detection. And nobody says no to that. What they say is they say yes, but. And there's always a but that is a barrier that you then have to overcome. So I don't think about the negative or the downsides. They don't really hold me back. It's more about how do I overcome this but? Then I really focus on that. So like from a strategy perspective, we're a company that is constantly just overcoming the buts, right? Like, oh, that's really great, but I don't have enough time. Okay, then we prove like this assessment can be done in less than 5 minutes in the waiting room where you won't have to do anything. Then it's like, oh, okay, great. But, it's not connected to so-and-so. And I'll be like, okay, great. Then our entire product strategy to make sure it's integrated into every system that they exist.
Great. So is it fair to say that even if you're tempted to what I'll call personalize the challenge, to say, hey, maybe I'm not the right person to do this, because that tends to be a recurring risk, right? To say, maybe I'm not the right person to be the founder, maybe I'm not the person to be leading this. It sounds to me like a more constructive strategy to be realistic, but at the same time be able to address that is to kind of take it outside of yourself and objectify it in some way and say, okay, this is a challenge that has a box, right? And it has boundaries. Yeah. And as long as I can put it in that box and I say, hey, this is the problem, it's nothing to do with me, there is a problem, right? And my job is to kind of figure out how to do it. It sounds to me like that is a healthy and constructive way, even if you are tempted to personalize the challenge to some extent, say, oh, I'm not smart enough to figure out that it should have been integrated with the systems or whatever, which tends to be, I can admit it's a challenge for me. It's like, maybe I don't know all the stuff that I need to know,
No. I think if you consider it a challenge or a objection you need to overcome, and you channel your time in trying to overcome that challenge, that's what makes being an entrepreneur so exciting.
That's for sure. So a couple of last questions. If you had to take a big step back and look at it at the 10,000 foot level, how would you say that being a woman has shaped this journey for you?
I think it's made me work harder. And I think it's made me even more data driven. So like I said in the beginning, it's that if you have a mark against you, but you know the scorecard that the VCs are going to use, you have to try harder on every other part of the scorecard.
Any other dimensions, softer aspects that pop into mind?
Being a woman.
Yeah.
I think I naturally attract a more diverse team of women that look up to me and can see career progression versus not being a female founder. And I really do think, were it not for my influence and sometimes my intervention, I think our culture and our diversity would be less diverse.
So what advice would you give STEM related ventures that need outside funding?
Ooh, this is a tough one. I think I think this works even not in the non-entrepreneurial context.
Mm-hmm.
I think everyone needs sponsors and champions.
Yeah.
And I think you need one person to be like a diehard fan of you and your company really, really early. Because a lot of it is references in the beginning. It's here, I'm going to introduce one of the most fantastic, smartest, exceptional people that I've ever worked with. You kind of need that. And in order to do that well, you need to get to know as many people as possible. That's what I would tell people. You got to get out. Don't sit at home. You got to collect people. Like you would collect customers. There are people around you that you need to think the world of you. You really just need a reference. You need somebody who's going to think that you're the greatest person ever. It doesn't even go out and meet a million people and become the most popular person. You really just need one person to be willing to open their Rolodex and tell the whole world what a great person you are.
Lastly, I want to wrap up with one question, which is, what's your vision for CancerIQ?
Be everywhere. I want your everyday primary care physician to use CancerIQ. I think there's such a big problem here in the States, and here's why. The US has overcome infectious disease, and they've overcome a lot of chronic conditions, and eventually we'll overcome even heart disease if we start eating better. All of these diseases, as we start surviving those other diseases, it leaves one outstanding problem. That's where we are as a society in the United States. When the cancer becomes the biggest problem in other countries, hopefully they'll look to what we've done in the United States as a model for them to adopt as well.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. Find show notes and more at achieve.co. That's achieve.co/podcast. Like what you heard? Hit subscribe on Spotify, Apple, or Google Podcast and never miss another episode. Want to help others like you? Leave us a review and tell a friend. See you on the next episode. Now, go achieve!